It's an absolute delight to be here to try and share some of the immensity of this world of printmaking. It's a fascinating topic. We can approach it from many different points of view. So I guess the first question that it begs is, where do we actually start within this scheme of possibilities? Consider this. When I think of printmaking, I think of these 5 domains of expertise, skills, understanding, and application. File preparation, materiality, the management of colour through our digital print paths, ink control, how the printer does what it does to put ink on media, and then, of course, in the eye of the beholder, our considerations, our concerns, what we turn these blobs of colour and shapes into as meaning, memory, hope, and desire. What's fascinating is that these first 4 categories we can think of more or less as being somewhat more objectified. Down here in the land of our imagination, our hopes and dreams, of course, this is as unique as you and I are to each other, at least so it appears. Where do we start, though? And when I was thinking about this, and importantly, because this is not a whole workshop, this is just hints and clues. So mainly it's going to be observational and some theory along the way, hopefully to fill in some gaps, alert you to some critical distinctions, and also some practical applications of all of the above. But that doesn't really help us as to where to start. Now, because we're talking about printmaking, returning the image to the world from which it came, in whatever format, design, or desire, it's a physical object that inhabits time and space the way we do. And often, especially from an artistic point of view, we confer all manner of agency to these things we make and exhibit and put in books and share amongst friends and colleagues. So materiality maybe is the place to start. And I should probably preface this. You'll see this over and over again, at least today. What I tripped over many years ago that I called famous 5s, there in the title. So much about digital imaging, especially photography, can be broken down effectively into 5s, for example. When talking about materiality, whether it's paper or other materials we print on. There are 5 categories by which we can describe those characteristics, that substance. Now, if we extrapolate this, colour is the paper, is the silk, is the cotton, a warm white, a cool white. Sounds very subjective, so we'll objectify that a little bit more shortly. Surface texture, for example, from ultra smooth to watercolor papers. What about finishes? From mirror high gloss to beautiful, soft, velvet, subtle surfaces that yield and reflect mainly diffuse light in profoundly interesting ways. What about the actual base itself? What are we printing on? From solids, metals, woods, things that don't bend. Therefore, the printer you put them through needs a flat print path. To woven materials, canvas, silk, cotton, and so on. And then what I find helpful, our 3 classes of papers. More about that in a second. And we cannot leave home without also considering the ink set, their colorants, and other properties, not just their gamut, not just their colorfulness, that we then deposit on the media to produce these things we call prints. Okay, colour, surface, finish, texture. Now, this is just theory at the moment, very low-level theory, but of course, to put some ideas in our head. And again, we are in a particular domain beginning with materiality. I will do a little bit on file preparation. I will do a little bit on the management of colour, characterization of print paths and so on, a little bit of ink control, and of course, you can make of it what you will. Now, here is another way of looking at this. Here is a family of media, beautiful papers produced by Canson in France. In full disclosure, I'm the original and still are a global ambassador for cancer. I've spent a lot of time with my friends over there in the UK and in France developing these papers and so on. Here is their range of beautiful papers using that classification that I was beginning to talk about. Fine art papers, photographic papers, commercial papers. This is my way of characterizing or compartmentalizing how these variables, these characteristics come together. Let's examine this in terms of navigating the options, the availability of beautiful papers on which to print. A lot of us with our own printers can't print on metal and can't print on canvas or silks or what have you, for all sorts of structural reasons, flexibility, print paths and so on. But even the most generic printer prints on paper. And I find it really helpful to distinguish between what I call commercial papers, cheap as chips, tough as nails papers, more about that shortly, more traditional photographic papers, and classic fine art papers. Now here is just one family, or one paper manufacturer and their exquisite offerings. From plastic resin-coated paper bases to fiber bases, where the alpha cellulose comes from tree pulp. So it's at the level of molecules, therefore the paper base is incredibly smooth. And often in our photographic lexicon, we coat the surface of those already very smooth papers with a solution of gelatin and barium sulfate, a very stable white pigment, which gives the smooth paper base an even smoother finish, not plastic and mechanical as cheap as chips, tough as nails, commercial papers, but organic and lively. If this was a workshop, I'd be showing you examples of these papers under high-resolution overhead cameras. You'd have paper samples in your very hand to experience this. But these are papers trying, in a digital pigment inkjet printing world, to mimic the look and the feel of traditional photographic papers, especially from the heights of modernism in the 20th century. And then, of course, the Arches mill in eastern France was established in 1493. It's still on the same spot, still drawing beautiful soft water out of the same river, goes back into the river cleaner than it comes out these days. And have a look at the bias in this family of offerings. Massive numbers of fine art matte-surfaced papers, beautiful traditional photographic papers, and a few cheap as chips, tough as nails, commercial papers. And I'd note that Canson bought the St. Cuthbert's mill in the UK, which several hundred years have manufactured magnificent, beautiful fine art papers, and they've now reimagined those papers and added them to their mold-made, traditional, highest possible quality offerings. So there's a way of thinking through, because if you Google inkjet printing paper, you'll get thousands of hits, and often the same papers are being talked about in different terms and with different stickers on the labels and different price tags, and they're the same paper out of the same factory. So there's just a way to think about and begin to conceptualize some of these offerings. Now, to finish this, here's another set of notes, trying to become less observational, less subjective in naming characteristics like commercial, resin-coated papers, are very cheap to purchase compared to the mold-made, beautiful fine art papers that have been with us for centuries and centuries. They're also, because of their plastic base, extraordinarily tough and hardy. So when prints need to be handled all the time for all manner of reasons, these papers are quite serviceable. You have to, with absolute love and devotion, handle our beautiful fine art papers with more care, simply because the pigment, the image, is sitting right on the surface. It's not encapsulated and therefore held onto the plastic base the way these commercial papers are. But having said that, consider the colour scale I've included, though this is in the process of being reconsidered, especially by Canson, who have now added minerals and pigments to their paper bases to enable traditional fine art papers like Aquarelle Rag, the world's highest grossing watercolor paper to create a slightly cooler version. But this is also giving us a sense that traditional commercial papers are very cold blue tone papers because of fluorescence. Photographic papers tend to appear a little more neutral, whereas fine art papers tend to, because of the very nature of the cotton base or the other sources of alpha cellulose that are woven together into those mold-made paper bases, tend to be warmer. Now, what does that mean? Because that's just me talking. Have a look at this line right across here. D50, the theoretical daylight standard, noonday sunshine, if you want to generalize it. Now, it's an overcast day. The light's quite cool and blue. It's probably around 6,500 degrees Kelvin. Haven't measured it here in my studio today. But if the crepuscular rays of sunshine broke through, they would be glowing golden in front of me, an experience all of us can attest to. So even though in the world of printmaking, noonday sunshine, 5,000 degrees Kelvin, correlated or otherwise, more or less, is considered our standard, simply because we've got to put a standard in place under which we're viewing our prints and making judgments about their density and their color, their overall appearance. Of course, a D50 standard makes sense, doesn't it? Because the sun's been around a lot longer than we have, and apparently it'll be around for a heck of a lot longer after we're no longer here to witness it. So that's it, but it's golden light more often than not. Notice the photographic papers. What am I looking at here? The LAB color model. Not RGB numbers, not CMYK numbers, which are device specific. The same set of RGB numbers mean a different color encoded into a different color gamut. Okay. But the LAB numbers divide our world of color into a lightness model based on the human visual system. I tend to disagree that is a good representation of how we experience lightness to darkness, but it doesn't matter. It's in that model and it's useful for what it is. And of course, these two color channels, north, south, east, west, if you want to simplify it on our color wheel, the yellow to blue and the cyan, green to magenta and pink. Now, why I'm bringing this up and why I'm using this, because these numbers are considered, in a sense, to be device independent. It's not your printer, it's not your paper, it's not my ink, it's not my monitor. And the B channel, that channel which on our color wheel maps the color temperature realm, if this is noonday sunshine, from warm light to cool light. The B channel, that's the B channel in lab. Look, here's using LAB to model this gamut. This is just the gamut of Adobe RGB. There's the B channel, and there's the tint channel, the A channel in LAB. That's what we're looking at. So the B channel as a measurement of the whiteness of the paper, the whiteness of the linen, is really helpful. Where positive numbers mean warmer and negative numbers mean bluer and colder. So if I look at classic reproductions of some beautiful, not cheap as chips, tough as nails commercial papers, but some beautiful photographic papers and magnificent historical fine art papers, this is what we're talking about when we're considering paper white and its tinting and coloration. Okay, now that's just a beginning and a setup. But where do I start if I'm new to printmaking? Of course, if you have a predisposition to certain characteristics, beautiful textured papers or high-gloss commercial papers or look-alike photographic papers from the darkroom, working at the speed of a dripping tap with our analog processors. And we can obtain sample packs and we can visit print studios and inspect these different textures. Here's just a few of my favorite papers from Canson. Look at edition etching. And of course, the sizing and everything else that goes into these papers confers incredible effects on their appearance. We just keep going, and there's canvas, woven materials, and acrylic rag. This is one version of that magnificent paper. So where do we start? Well, if in doubt, start in the middle, something that is a traditional photographic paper, even a beautiful baryta paper, where its appearance is neither as warm or as cool as it can be. We'll consider this further in a moment in an editing program like Photoshop. But before that, I want to preface what I'm going to do with some basic color management. Remember, in the 5 domains of printmaking, the management of color is a huge consideration. Of course, we present whole workshops on this, so this is just a snapshot, but let's consider for a moment this picture of mine, which is a diagram of a contemporary workflow. Where in the northern hemisphere, we've got input devices. In the southern hemisphere, we've got output devices like my beautiful ASO graphics monitor. I'm looking at this on for our beautiful photographic and inkjet printers like my Epson and Canon Pro printers, or a $10 million printing press in downtown Beijing, printing my book and so on. And here I am sitting at my workstation, at my computer, right in the middle, viewing what I'm doing on the screen, contemplating this print path and making and printing an image, which we're going to look at in a moment. Of course, we're surrounded by all of these devices, and there's many more that we can add into this mix. And those devices are extremely good at doing one thing extremely well, and that is completely and utterly mucking up color. So we have to protect ourselves, put a prophylactic in place, if you like, between these aberrant devices and our good selves. And of course, that's a characterization, which we'll often call a profile. For example, let's say that every file of mine, every image, whatever it is, beautiful portrait, a tear-stained face, a magnificent vista, the subject matter does not matter in this instance. It's data that's being sent to my printer and being interpreted and turned from red, green, and blue light into a sea of variable sizes of dots and colors and placement. Okay, let's just say that my print path, whatever it is, applies 20% too much red to every image I send through it. When we've tested and characterized that behavior in my print path, we can encode that error into a lookup table, printer profile, that unseen by me and you when it's inserted into a color-savvy, color-managed print path. Printing out of Photoshop, for example, removes 20% of the red from the file so that when the printer does its dastardly act and renders that data as a print, it's no longer too red, it's correct red. What a massive oversimplification. Even an 8-bit notation, 2 to the power of 8, and 256 possible levels of redness and greenness and blueness. Oh my goodness gracious me. Do the maths. You can see 20% too much red is an oversimplification, but hopefully that gives you the idea. So, back to our domains. If for nothing else, yes, the more accurately we can characterize our print path in the traditional ICC, International Color Consortium, characterization of a printer profile, then the less disappointed and wasteful of our time and our hard-earned money, let alone beautiful papers, will be the case. Now, printer manufacturers of beautiful papers, Canson in France, Hahnemühle in Germany, Moab in the United States, and so on, provide generic profiles, not for your printer, not for your inkset, but for your model of printer and that group of papers. So at the very least, which I'm going to segue to now, at the very least, we should be putting in place at least a generic paper profile. But when time is money and quality needs to be assured, then of course a custom-made, bespoke characterization of that paper, that inkset, your printer, your working environment, and so on and so forth. That's an essential component in this workflow. Right now, just looking at the domains again, just noting a couple of key distinctions along the way. A lot on materiality, because we're making a physical object of print that re-inhabits the world, and we bestow so much agency and so much care and concern on it. Color management. Ink control is also part of that, but let's just for the moment accept how the printer, be it an Epson, a Canon, a Hewlett-Packard printer, how that actually manages the mixing of different colorants together. Let's just accept that simply because we can make more headway in this short presentation by considering file preparation. And to do that, is there a more ubiquitous editing creation program than Adobe Photoshop, burdened with legacy issues and such inconsistency and, oh my goodness gracious me, such craziness? But it's everywhere, and it has been there for over 30 years. So let's use this as a case study of how to print our images, that print path, and most importantly, color management, but also this idea of file preparation. Now, here's a classic example, courtesy of a 1993 Kodak CD when they were trying to sell me something that I wasn't particularly interested in buying. This infamous lighthouse. Now, maybe this looks great on your monitor. Here's another conundrum if we think of that ring around where we were in the middle, the components of a contemporary color managed workflow. We're printing to a printer. We're also viewing the same data through another profile, my monitor profile. This may look great on your monitor. It looks terrible on my monitor, but my monitor is calibrated to a specific standard. More about that in a few moments. So I'm looking at this, but hang on, that's just me looking at it. And what if I'm viewing this on an iPad or a MacBook Pro or an Asus laptop or something that has no calibration or lacks the ability that my gorgeous ASO Color Edge graphics monitor provides me with? And at the end, I will point you to our website and a lot of videos and notes that extend this discussion if you're so interested. But at the moment, warning bells are going off before I even load a sheet of beautiful paper, let alone consider what paper, let alone whether a warm or a cool or a neutral white, but its appearance is not right. It's a digital file, so I can also use the numbers in that file here in Photoshop's info palette, the numbers in that file to adjudicate what's going on, and then I'll fix it really quickly for you. For example, in Photoshop, where I have an eyedropper sampling tool, of course, the pipette size I need to designate. I don't want to measure single pixels because that can be unbelievably misleading. And notice in the first readout, it's actual colors. This is an RGB file, 3 color channels, red light plus green light plus blue light. It's an RGB file. But look at what I've selected in my second color picker, that more objective, not device specific, LAB color model. It's also rounding off to whole integers, of course, but at least it's better than nothing, reporting the lightness and also the coloration. Now, I reckon this is white paint in beautiful sunshine. And if I have a look at what's going on over here, look at the B channel, 18, 19. This is as yellow as can be. Remember, positive numbers in the B channel means warm tones. And there's a bit of magenta thrown in for good measure in the A channel. But it's also around 82 or so percent. 2%, hang on, white paint in sunshine? Boy, I should be wearing sunglasses. 82% feels and looks and measures as very dull. So we have some significant issues here. I'll just reset my workspace to clean all of that up for you. We've got some significant file preparation issues before spending any time, any consideration, let alone beautiful materials, ink and so forth, to print this image only to discover it is as awful as it is. So a little bit of reconnaissance beforehand, numerically and visually on a calibrated monitor can help. But what do I do with it? If you're not a Photoshop aficionado, that doesn't matter, because what I'm going to demonstrate in Photoshop is generic. And there's many ways of doing this. But we've really only got time for one such approach if I'm trying to also include other understandings and observations and a little bit of extra theory to put into practice. Most programs, though you have to search and find them, will have auto adjustments, auto tone, auto contrast. It doesn't really help, does it, in terms of what the hell is going on? What is this trying to explain, dear old Adobe? I also have, for example, if this was binary data straight out of my camera or my scanner, raw data, ones and zeros, lots of bit slices to add up and turn them into our arithmetic, then I've got the possibility, because I have to turn that binary data into RGB data that I can display on a monitor, I can send to a printer. So here in Photoshop, if this was a raw file, it would begin life by opening up in their Camera Raw module, the plugin, because dear old, tired old, legacy-bound Photoshop can't interpret binary data. We need a plugin to interpret it. And look, it's turned it into RGB data. Now, of course, over here with white balance, getting white's white and grey's grey and black's black, eyedroppers, let's just white balance on that area. Now, I'm not saying this is the ultimate color correction, but at least I have, and I can't, this is Camera Raw, the development module in Lightroom, I can't reposition these windows for you. But if you look up here, having right-clicked on my histogram, I've also got LAB readouts being reported, and have a look at this. Depending on the resolution of your screen, you may or may not be able to see the numbers, but at least those numbers are now showing A and B color channels close to 0. But it's still only 83% lightness, so I need to adjust it further. For example, just using keyboard shortcuts, if I bring up a levels histogram where I see the distribution of red light, green light, and blue light in the image, and no pixels in the blue channel are anywhere near specularity, 255 in 8-bit notation, of course. That's 100% brightness. What I need to do is find the first appearance of white. Now, I can do that laboriously by going into threshold mode and just finding the first hint of that. But I can also, right, and this is a more useful enunciation of what's up here under auto tone, contrast, and color. Wouldn't be Photoshop, wouldn't be Adobe if the same things were not named differently. And lingering for a moment brings up these more extended and helpful descriptions. But hang on, look at what's just happened to my image. Enhance monochromatic contrast, enhance per channel contrast. This is, dear Photoshop, automatically finding the brightest and darkest pixels in the red and the green and the blue channels and setting them to 0 and 255. And suddenly, this area, my goodness gracious me, that black hole of black holes, if that's not black, I don't know what is black in the world of appearances. That's now black instead of a dull grey that it was. This is now approaching scintillating white. Just look at the difference without changing any of the defaults. And there's other variations we can try on, but really, that's the ABC of it, and auto correction on all 3 channels. I click OK, and you can see the before and the afters. There's just a few seconds on file preparation at the very least. Now, I'm not saying every image needs specularity, pure white, the direct reflections of the light source. I'm not saying every image needs a few pixels of absolute black, but the number one reason when people come to us and complain, why are my prints so muddy? Why don't my prints look as good as the image looks on my monitor? Number one reason is the mud comes from not having adapted the dynamic range, the range of brightnesses in the image to the maximum range of brightnesses my particular printer, ink, and paper can print, hopefully characterized through a custom profile of that condition. So I now want to print this out of programs like Photoshop, Lightroom, and so on. We can then call up generic print dialog boxes, as I'm doing now. But we can also choose, if time is money and there's other professional considerations involved, we can also choose to not print out of these editing applications, but to instead send the file to a professional, fully fledged printing application. But that's another story for another day. Let's just concentrate on doing this without that added expense, without that other steep learning curve. And despite the horrendous, confusing interface design of Photoshop, the same thing called something different depending on where you find it, this is actually really helpful. Have a look at the bounding boxes. Remembering this is the print dialog box. I'm now sending this image to paper and ink in my printer. Of course, right at the very top, I've got to tell it which printer I'm printing to. What about my gorgeous little A2 desktop printer from Epson, the P900 or 906 in Australia, sitting on my network? See the bounding box? That's one set of conditions, because it takes two to tango when it comes to printing. But hang on, Les, where am I in my domains? I've done some file preparation. Oh, yes, now I've got color management and ink control to execute. So I'm on my way to sending this data to my printer. Now, it takes two to tango, because we need to issue instructions at the operating system level, be it on Windows or Unix, or in this case, I'm on a Macintosh OS. Okay. And the first cab off the rank is me saying, oh, by the way, dear Photoshop, dear Macintosh OS, this is the printer I'm looking to print to. But look, there's another dialog box down here, which includes positioning and scaling. Oh, hang on, but up here, a little confusing, but you find the things you need to find eventually. Oh, it's a vertical image, so I'd better choose a vertical format that I'm printing on. But color management, the document file is untagged. Oh, are you kidding me? Untagged. What do you mean? There's no colorimetric meaning assigned to the numbers. So how on earth am I going to do a transformation from numbers whose colors are not defined? Quick, let's cancel out of there for a moment. And where's my info palette again? Yes, untagged RGB. I therefore need, before I even begin this print part, and it's just a touch more on color management, I need to now define what colors those RGB numbers mean. But I didn't make this image. It comes from a Kodak CD, royalty-free, 1993. Goodness, I wouldn't even know who to phone these days in Rochester, upstate New York, to ask the question. So I'm going to map the undefined RGB numbers, their unknown colorimetric meaning, into different color spaces to see if there is oh, that's a little overdone. Okay, well, what about ubiquitous sRGB? Or what about beautiful Adobe RGB? Or what about color match RGB? Dear old Photoshop provides us with legacy, going way, way back, decades and decades, legacy color models, even though we haven't used a lot of these for decades and decades. How extraordinary. Color matches looking good on my monitor. Wow, look at how the lighthouse is now being rendered. Look at the space, its navigation, both in time and distance. I like what I'm seeing here. Now let's return to that print dialog box. And now our color manage settings, the set of instructions that we get to issue at the level of the application, in this case, Adobe Photoshop. Whatever the application is. But hang on, Photoshop is selected by default to let the printer manage the color? Not a good idea. Though my beautiful little Epson A2 desktop printer can print highest photographic quality imaginable, it can put dots of ink down on paper in ways and in combinations that are almost beyond reckoning. In terms of managing colors, no. So I'm going to ask the application, Photoshop, to manage color instead. And as soon as that is selected, look at what I get. I then get access to printer profiles. And forgive me, I've got a few, and we are printing to my Epson P900. Got it. And here, you'll have to forgive me for my nomenclature. I've got to fit a lot of metadata into only 31 characteristics. But here I've selected my Epson 906 with Canson Baryta photographic. If you can name any airport in the world with a country code and a three-letter designation, MELBNELAX. Good enough for airports, good enough for papers. Epson P906 Canson Baryta, and most importantly, the settings that I need to tell the operating system to use with this characterization. So I'm printing on beautiful traditional photographic paper. And I then only have to tell it as to how to do that transformation from the source to the destination profile. From the source, color match RGB, sRGB, Adobe RGB, whatever the file is in, to the destination profile. That is where we are in our color managed printmaking workflow. And we only have 4 sets of instructions. Colorimetric is, let's just simplify it by saying It's the most numerically accurate transformation if the profile is well made, while perceptual is the more perhaps pleasing. But really, this is about two different conditions in the world of printing. Colors that can be printed accurately will numerically be printed accurately with a really good colorimetric table. Relative just means we're transferring the white point from the source to the paper white. Absolute means we're preserving the source white point. So we're printing with relative colorimetric. We're not proofing. But perceptual is for when we have colors in the image which are outside of that printable gamut. Now, dear Photoshop has the ability, even in the print dialog box, to match colors and, most importantly, to give us a hint as to whether or not any colors are grayed out and therefore telling us they can't be printed. But with the gamut warning turned off and on, while proofing the image, converting the image in my print path, while proofing the image, now transforming that image into my printer profile and then back to my monitor profile. So I'm seeing a simulation of it on my screen, turning gamut warning on and off, no problems at all. The sky's not covered in grey, the buoy's not covered in grey. None of those colours are outside of the ability for me to print them, at least according to Photoshop. And therefore, I have a clear choice. Relative colorimetric will be really accurate, but let's not discount perceptual, because perceptual is not just about how do I map colors in my file that cannot be printed accurately, but how do I print them to create the illusion that they are correct. We certainly do build a huge range of other considerations, mainly aesthetic, personality-based considerations into our perceptual tables, because we're not trying to be numerically accurate, but perceptually beautiful. Therefore, I'm going to bias that rendering to my liking. But of course, it takes two to tango. So the last task is print settings. And inside the print settings, yes, there is my printer. And most importantly, color matching. Now, because I've told the application, please Photoshop, please application manage color. So of course, this is grayed out in terms of the operating system. It's okay, you're managing the color. We don't need to worry about it for the moment. But then the print settings inside the print settings dialog box are really important, because this is where we then have to, and according to the manufacturers, or if I've made the profile for you, my instructions, we then choose the right base characteristics, the right base media, maximum quality, and so on, printing with color, of course. These are the instructions, and I'm so paranoid about this, I write these instructions into the profile's name, the top level of metadata. Manufacturers won't do that. Canson doesn't, Hahnemuhle doesn't, Moab doesn't. They have separate documents, PDFs, that tell you those instructions. You can also try and save some of those settings, unless you're on the latest Mac OS, which doesn't save any of these instructions. This still works on Windows, saved as a preset, the ability to repeat this over and over again so you don't waste time. And with all of those settings in place, I'm ready to print. Thank you very much, Photoshop. But to finish off, I've done everything you said. I've even used one of your custom profiles that I haven't held back. I've got a beautiful photographic printer sitting on my desk, a magnificent Pro 1000 A2 printer from Canon, and my prints look awful compared to my screen. What am I doing wrong? What's going wrong? So what we now need to do is spend a few moments, only need a few moments, to consider observing what we see on the screen and what conditions do we need to put in place before we can even begin to hold a print up and compare it with its appearance on our screen. For example, here I am in my studio, walls of glass everywhere. Now, it turns out that I adapt to this environment, whatever the environment I'm in. As well, up there, look at that beautiful sky. That's the brightest highlight. So that's what white is today. And over there under the coffee maker in the corner, that's the darkest dark. So my brain auto exposures, auto color corrects, and there's white and there's black today. And my monitor, which I'm seeing relative to my adaptation, more or less to the environment it's in, that confers what I see on my monitor. So here's the big trick. take a sheet of your beautiful printing paper, fill your screen with white, just white, and then compare the whiteness of the screen with the whiteness of the paper that you're printing on. And if the brightness of the white of the paper, and you don't hold it right against the screen, you have half a meter in front of it so you don't have any backlight coming through. If the whiteness of the paper and the whiteness of the screen aren't the same, look, not even close here, then there's no way under this level of adaptation you can compare what you're seeing in the print with its appearance on the screen, even in color managed dear old Photoshop. Therefore, turning on proofing lights and adjusting our proofing lights, then we can start to say, oh, goodness gracious me, now whites match whites. I can then begin, it's only the beginning, this gets complicated quite quickly, I can then begin to be confident. At least I'm playing by the same rules, I'm on the same field of endeavor, at least it's a beginning of a conversation. Now this opens up a can of worms in terms of monitor calibrations and all of this. So let me finish with directing you to our website where there's lots of information. And I'm talking mainly about the support menu, not all the art history and theory and philosophy over here, not our workshops or collaborative services, but notes and videos. So to extend this discussion, including some of the notes that I've already been using from our digital print workshop, under notes, I've got different categories: calibrating, monitor calibration, introduction to monitor calibration, looking at the 2 ISO standards that govern these conditions if you're scratching your head and wondering, but also, most importantly, tempering the brightness of our monitors to be commensurate with the brightness of lighting under which we are likely, from extremes of museum archival darkness to 3,000–4,000 lux of light here mid-morning, mid-afternoon in my studio, tempering the maximum peak brightness of my monitor, and most importantly, the contrast ratio to then represent the contrast ratio of a beautiful print on beautiful paper such as Canson-Baryta Photographic. Now, there's heaps and heaps there for you. Click on videos, it goes to our YouTube channel, advanced monitor calibration, soft proofing, endless things. And test files that we can even print out. Here's a 21-step grayscale. You can download it from that calibration website, print it out on your favorite paper. It's in LAB numbers, device independent. Oh, Photoshop's telling me 25% lightness in the shadows on that image of mine. Gee, that's really dark on my printout here. So even in a less than ideal working, uncalibrated environment, you can still have simple distinctions like that to help you avoid some of the biggest potholes. All right, hopefully that's been somewhat interesting at the very least. If not helpful, if I've failed miserably, please forgive me. Maybe you'll be gracious enough to give me another go at another time. But let's see what questions there are and if I can further elucidate any of these distinctions for you. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity. Wish you all the best with your adventures in the world of magnificent color. Cheers.